Hi, I'm Alex Idris, and thanks for joining us for our fourth set of Boldmethod Live. Tonight we're going to be talking about gusty winds, which I think is pretty timely because as we move into spring, you're going to start to see quite a few of these. And we're going to go through some examples into Page, Arizona, but we're first going to start by talking about why the jet stream and some weather patterns kind of promote gusty winds during the spring. We've left a lot of time for questions tonight, so all throughout the broadcast, please throw your questions in. We've got Corey Komarick on the chat. He'll be forwarding those over to Colin, who's our technical director tonight, and he'll be putting those up as graphics on screen. So keep the questions coming. We'll start by diving into a little bit of weather. So if you watch the news, you probably heard about that polar low pressure bomb that happened on April 11th. We'll jump to the iPad. I've got a picture here that I snapped from ForeFlight. The cool thing about ForeFlight when you have weather patterns that move through is you can watch the winds and you can watch the pressure and the temperatures as it moves across the United States. And this is as that bomb started to really speed up just inside of Nebraska. You can see where the low pressure is. It's the light set of wind right here in Nebraska. You can see that's just 10 knots. But as you look at the winds around it, they're turning counterclockwise, basically working along those isobars, cycling into the low. And they're strong. So we've got a few. This one right here is 30 knots, 20 knots, 25 knots. We've got 35 knots here just outside of Denver. And as that butts up against the Rocky Mountains, one of the reasons I love living in Boulder is you can see the winds died out right along the mountain range. And of course, with that, you end up getting a lot of these. So here's a pilot report. And I'll walk through this in case you're not familiar with them. It's an urgent pilot report. We know that because of the UUA. It's over KRVS, just outside of Tulsa. The time was 23:49 Zulu at flight level 002, which would be 200 feet AGL. The type is a Cessna 172. Remarks, low-level wind shear, lost 15 knots between the surface and 200 feet during descent for runway 31 at RVS. And that's pretty typical for the spring. In fact, I had the same thing happen to me about a week ago coming back from North Dakota. The weather was forecast to be pretty good, but showery, and in the showers we were forecast to have gusty winds. When I arrived back at Rocky Mountain Metro, the winds were gusting 24 to 34 knots, and as I pulled up just above the touchdown zone, I lost I'd say about 8 knots and pushed a go-around. So this is definitely the time of year for gusty winds. Okay, let's take a look at our first video tonight. I'm going to jump over to a flight that we had into Page, Arizona a few years ago. Page is just outside of Lake Powell. We're coming in the spring and monsoon season. And keep in mind, our normal approach speed in the Cirrus is going to be 80 to 85 knots with full flaps. You can see on the left side, right here, my airspeed. And you can see how much it's changing. We ended up with about 14 knot wind gusts on our approach to runway 15, and you can see the airspeed wind up and wind down on our way in. So, how do we handle that? Most people know that the typical rule that you're going to follow is 1/2 of the gust factor. So, how do you compute that? Well, let's take a look at the next animation. Okay, here we are, final for runway 15. And let's start by looking at the winds. The winds in this case were out of 270 at 10 gusting to 24. Okay, so to figure out the gust factor, you're just simply going to take 24 knots, not 27, 24 knots minus 10. That leaves you with a gust factor of 14 knots. Okay, and then you're going to take half of that. So half of 14 is 7. And in this case, we're going to add 7 knots to our final approach speed. And we'll use that as we fly into the runway. So jumping back in here, you can see our airspeed over here. Normally, we want to be between 80 knots to 85 knots on final. And normally I'm more close to the 85 knots, especially if I'm loaded heavy, which I was at this point. So if I want to add 7 knots to that, .92 knots is my new final approach airspeed. And that half gust factor works for any airplane. Whether you're flying a 172 or a Piper Warrior or a twin, adding half the gust factor usually works pretty well. So let's watch this as we fly in. So you can see here the gusts are constantly changing my airspeed, and I'm moving through 92 knots above and below, but that's okay because I have a large margin on my stall speed. There it is as I come into the runway. If you look at that margin, it's pretty darn big. And we'll take that in all the way to touchdown. Okay, so that brings up the question, if you're flying fast on final, aren't you going to float? And the answer is, in gusty winds, a little bit. First of all, you've got a headwind. Usually in this case, we had 10 gusting to 24, so we had a 10 knot headwind, and the headwind itself is going to prevent us from floating too far. But the other problem is, we don't want to end up too close to our stall speed, or otherwise we could stall onto the runway. And so we're going to accept a little bit of float and basically let the airplane fly. So let's take a look at a case if we were to get the airplane too slow and see what would happen. Okay, in this case, I'm flying my standard final approach speed. And you can see right there, as I hit a lull, this is my stall speed. And the interesting thing on a Cirrus, a mini new glass cockpit equipped aircraft, is this stall band is dynamic. It's oftentimes based off the angle of attack indicator, so that could actually be my stall speed. So the problem with flying your published speeds on final is that if you end up getting it's not a strong gust, but if the strong gust dies out suddenly, you're going to bleed off that airspeed, and you can end up very, very close to your stall speed. And you can see how much we gain, and the same thing could happen again as we come in towards the runway. So our goal is simply to keep that half gust factor in, and then as we're coming in, here we are in short final, we are a little bit faster than we would normally be as we start the round out. And we're just going to keep the airplane along center line, holding the aircraft in the landing attitude, boom, until it starts to touch down. If you go back, I was aiming for the aiming point markers right here. That's where I almost always aim when I'm coming into an airport. That's where I wanted to touch down. So that's one stripe after. Let's just watch and see how far I ended up floating. So that's that first stripe, the second stripe, so about 2 stripes. Essentially, what I'm trying to do is keep the aircraft in the landing attitude, and I'm accepting a couple hundred feet of extra distance to allow the aircraft to touch down. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, we're going to start off here. This is a question we got from John. And his question is, will it help to reduce flaps on a gusty wind landing, or should I leave my flaps full?
Okay, so it depends a little bit on the aircraft that you're flying. There's some advantages to flaps. First of all, flaps tend to add stability because they add drag. And one of the things that you can think about is the tail on a kite. If you were to fly a kite with a short tail or without a tail, it tends to move around a lot. As we add that drag onto the airplane, the aircraft oftentimes feels more stable. If you've gone through multi-engine training, one of the things you learn is that flaps can make the aircraft more stable if you lose an engine, though they have a performance penalty. So in a gusty wind landing, using flaps tends to add stability, and it depresses your stall speed. You stall slower. So they usually are a benefit. There are a couple problems that you can end up with flaps. First of all, in a crosswind, some aircraft end up with airflow problems at full flaps. So, for example, some of the older 172s didn't recommend slips with flaps, with full flaps, 40 degrees of flaps. And that's because the flaps can actually, grab this airplane here, not a 172, but the flaps can actually start to blanket the rudder and the elevator with their airflow. And so you may end up losing some control effectiveness. The other problem you could get if you have a crosswind and you've got your flaps down is that your final approach speed is slow. It's slower than if you had your flaps up. And so because of that, that crosswind essentially is affecting you more. So by leaving your flaps up and carrying a higher final approach speed, you don't need quite as much crosswind correction. And the more airspeed that you have going over your rudder, the more effective your rudder is as well. So it really kind of comes down to your airplane. I can tell you in the Cirrus SR20 and SR22, I would almost always land the airplane with full flaps. In fact, the only time I go to partial flaps is typically on an instrument approach, and that's because we use flaps 50 on our final approach on an instrument approach. In the Warrior, flying that and the Seminole, same thing. I almost always use full flaps. In a 172, I would consider using partial flaps if the crosswinds are strong, but if it's a straight headwind right down the pipe and gusty, there's usually not an issue with kind of your full normal landing flaps. The other thing to check is your POH, especially in the landing procedures. If you get into section 5, see if I can remember this. In the landing procedures, make sure that it doesn't have a prohibition on full flaps, but generally they add stability. They make the airplane easier to control. We're going to talk about one problem that flaps can lead to in a second, but we'll get there. Okay, next question.
Okay, next up, this one's from Jim, and he says, how much airspeed loss should trigger a go-around on a gusty landing?
That's a good question. Part of the problem is you're not always watching your airspeed indicator because you're scanning inside and outside. And to me, it's more a sink rate or I'm no longer in line with the runway, or I end up with a stall warning that I didn't expect. Anything that happens that is significantly unexpected, to me, that's going to trigger a go-around. So if I'm on final and I feel like I've got that half gust factor in and all of a sudden I end up with a stall warning horn, typically that's going to trigger a go-around to me because I wasn't expecting it. I thought that airspeed padding would be good enough. And I'll typically come back around and I'll set up and I'll add another 2 or 3 knots. The other things with gusty winds that will typically trigger a go-around with me is all of a sudden I'm no longer in the correct landing attitude. And a good example, I don't have a video of it now, but I can describe it. We're landing in 42 knot winds in Hutchinson, Kansas, which we've landed in before, but we just had some gusts kind of rolling down the airfield. And the entire flight was incredibly stable until about 200 feet. And one of those gusts just rolled the aircraft into an unusual attitude. And that, even though you could correct it, to me, that's something that I would suggest that you go around in. The other thing is all of a sudden if your sink rate becomes uncontrollable, you're lined up, and you just start sinking, and you end up really pushing the power in, same thing, that's something that I would use to go around. So I'm not really using the amount of airspeed loss as I am using, hey, have I gotten to the point where I've started to hear or feel stall warning? So I got the horn that comes off, or I can feel the controls get mushy, something where I know, wow, I've got a lot lower buffer on stall than I thought. I'll come around and fly it at higher speed. The other one is if my sink rate goes bad, and all of a sudden I'm really dropping into the runway more than I would expect, then I'm going to bring the power up and go around, or any sort of an unusual attitude. And it's not always, I should say, not always sink rate. Telluride, one of our favorite places to fly, and that intro also is known for very gusty winds, and those gusty winds create huge updrafts and downdrafts. One of the issues that we ran into, normally you're going to land on runway 9, and it's kind of runway 9 landing, runway 27 departure. But if you end up with a really strong wind out of the west, landing on runway 9 really doesn't work out very well. So I had circled for 27, and as we came over the end of the run, or came over on about quarter-mile final, we were right on glide path, and we ended up picking up 1,000 foot per minute climb rate that I could not arrest. So even with the throttle at idle in an SR22 turbo, which tends to drop like a rock, I just couldn't get it to maintain any sort of a glide path. So again, that's a condition that I'm going to take the airplane around in. A situation where I'm no longer able to keep that aircraft on the glide path I want. Okay, next question.
Okay, next up. This is a really good question. The principle of adding half the gust factor is in the Cirrus POH, but does the same principle apply to other single-engine airplanes?
Yeah, this is a general principle that you can use with any airplane. And not every aircraft manufacturer mentions it in the POH, but you will find it in the FAA manuals. You find it, I think it's in the Airplane Flying Handbook. It's a typical kind of generally accepted procedure. And in fact, in Cirrus's case, they're just citing the FAA recommendation and putting it into the POH. And you'll find a lot of those recommendations that you see in a POH are fairly global. But some of the limitations aren't. But this will work in any airplane, again, from a tail wheel, a Piper Cub, all the way out to a twin-engine Seminole or a Seneca. Adding half a gust factor is pretty typical. Next question.
Okay, we'll throw one more in here before we let you keep moving forward. This one comes from Mark, and Mark says, I have a 1976 straight tail Lance. My POH is vague on what to do with landings and gusty winds with respect to flaps and speeds. What's your recommendation?
Okay, that's a great question. I started out flying a 69 and a 73-172, and they really weren't POHs. They were like a little pamphlet that they would give you that listed some basic performance, and that's the end of it. So if you're flying aircraft, especially aircraft in the pre-80s, man, those POHs are bare bones, and it can be very, very difficult to kind of pick out what you should do in the airplane. First of all, one of the things I recommend in an airplane like that is see if you can find a flight instructor that's got a reasonable amount of time in it, who can take you around and fly with you in it, because each airplane has its own characteristics. And I know that, for me, I really only started to feel perfectly, I wouldn't say perfectly, but real comfortable. Like I felt like I was, part of the airplane in the SR-22T until I had about 500 hours in it. So if you can find someone who's got a lot of time in it, that's great. But the other thing that I can tell you is cautiously fly your normal approach with your half gust factor and see how the aircraft handles. And if you find that the aircraft, if the wind is making if the crosswind's hard to control, if the aircraft's control is difficult, then try it again with partial flaps. And if that feels more comfortable with you, that's how you should fly the airplane. One of the keys is, there's some basic guidelines. Half gust factor, in some Cessnas, reducing the flaps, or if the crosswind's too strong, reducing the flaps. But then it also comes down to your experience with the airplane. And I put that in some limits, because I've met some people who say, yeah, my airplane lands real great if I land it 10 knots fast. No airplane lands great if you land 10 knots fast. You're just landing hot. And eventually you'll end up off the side or the end of the runway. So as long as you're following those established norms, a lot of it now becomes your experience with the airplane. So again, what I'd say is start with your normal landing configuration, adding half the gust factor. And if you find that those full flaps get you too close to that stall speed or the aircraft becomes difficult to control, bring the aircraft around and bring it, fly it with flaps maybe 50% or a notch lower and see how it performs there. One of the things that we do is we get back into gusty wind season. Winter here it can get gusty in the mountains, but man, on the Front Range, it's usually pretty calm. And so I kind of lose I wouldn't say my crosswind proficiency completely, but I definitely feel a little bit of rust. And so as spring comes on, I get the airplane back out and I go look for those, usually in Laramie, because there's tons of gusty winds in Laramie and gusty crosswinds. And I just get myself back to, okay, this is where I like to set each of my, my flaps, my speeds, and it gives me a chance to figure out, what part makes me comfortable. That's what I would recommend there. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of errors, because as we said, we are flying this approach a little bit fast. We're adding half the gust factor. So that means we're going to tend to float as we round out and flare and go down the runway, especially if the gusts start to die out. I've had that happen. Man, it's gusty at altitude, and then you get kind of into that surface friction, and all those gusts go away and the wind dies out. And now all of a sudden, you're hauling. Okay, so what do? Okay, so what we showed here in this video, we'll watch it one more time, is you just hold the airplane in the landing attitude. You can see that's what I'm doing. I'm just holding one constant pitch attitude. In fact, if you go back, I'm going to pause it here. You'll notice the horizon doesn't change much. If that's where the horizon's at. There we go. Now it's going to stay stable. It really doesn't change much. It sits right there, and I'm just kind of holding it in the landing attitude. until we touch down. That's what you want to do. And if you feel like you're running out of usable runway, I typically establish a point on the runway that I need to touch down by. And if I am not down by that point, I'm going to take the aircraft around. So if we were to try to push the airplane down, we can end up with this. So here we are coming into the runway, and I am absolutely sure I'm going to land it, so I actually force it on. Now what happens most commonly is this right here, you end up bouncing. So as we go back, you can see as the aircraft hits on the main wheels, it's not that the landing gear springs the aircraft up, it's that the tail moves down. And that increases your angle of attack. You can see that happen here, right as we kind of go in, bounce, and that angle of attack comes up, and that increases lift. There's a little bit of this that happens from your tires, but the biggest issue is the impact. Your tail continues to move down. And the second problem, if you think about it, you're holding back pressure onto the yoke typically during landing. And it's natural tendency, if you hit hard, to add more back pressure. That's exactly what happens. You add more back pressure, which moves your elevator, increases your nose's angle of attack, and now you're adding on more lift. But the problem is when you bounce, you might be faster than you should be. Okay, you're not quite at touchdown speed yet, but you're really, really close. So when we go back to the iPad and you see that angle of attack increase, what's also increasing here is drag. By increasing that angle of attack, you've added quite a bit of drag onto the airplane. And so now your indicated airspeed is winding down typically. You're getting slower as you're climbing up. And so you've heard of porpoising, where the aircraft basically, it hits and then it hits and it keeps hitting. And essentially what's happening is you're bleeding off airspeed all the way through that maneuver. But the impact force and your back pressure and the tail is causing the aircraft to jump back up and up and up. Those bounces can get bigger because those movements become greater. And the airspeed gets slower, and eventually it gets slow enough that the nose comes down and you impact on the nose wheel. And so that's the issue there with trying to force the airplane down or bouncing it. And in a more extreme case, you could end up wheelbarrowing the airplane or landing on the main first. So the key is just hold that landing attitude and understand my touchdown point in Gusty Winds, it's variable. It's a touchdown zone. It's not necessarily a touchdown spot. The other issue that you can have shows up on rollout. And that's because you're still very close to flying speed as you're rolling down the runway. So what happens if you get a 7-knot gust? Well, of course, that's 7 more knots of airspeed. And if you're holding back pressure in to keep that angle of attack up, you could end up with this. So here we are rolling down the runway, and boom, that headwind gust gives us a secondary liftoff. And that's something, everybody knows it's happening. You're generating lift all the way through your ground roll until you're extremely slow. So you know that you're generating the lift, and all of a sudden, as soon as the gust happens, that angle of attack can cause you to generate enough lift that takes the airplane off. And the problem that you've got now is your throttle's at idle, your airspeed's already fairly slow. As soon as that gust goes away, as soon as that's gone, your airspeed's going to quickly bleed off and the airplane ends up right back on the runway. So typically, if I have a secondary liftoff where the airplane's mains come off the ground, I've definitely had cases where the nose gear is off the ground. And it's a way I'll use to bleed off airspeed sometimes on a ground roll. But if the mains come back off the ground and I'm flying again, I treat that as a go-round, because I'm going to need to add power anyways to try to cushion that. And to get that perfectly right so that that lull in the wind doesn't slam you back on, that's fairly difficult. Okay, another question.
Okay, we got a whole bunch of questions here. We'll just try to get through all of them. We're pretty good on time. Next one is coming from Greg, and Greg says, when you're in gusty wind conditions, are you trying to negate the airspeed gains and losses with power and pitch, or are you just allowing them to come and go?
Okay, let's jump back into the HUD. That is a really good question. Let me get rid of this. We'll see how good of a job. People ask us all the time how we do this HUD. We hear this all the time, and the answer, by the way, if you want to know how we do the HUD, is we've got a software system we built in-house that draws the overlays. But they are basically animated by hand by watching cockpit footage. So we're going to see how good of a job the animator did. That's call on this. But
probably an amazing job.
Again, and I really didn't do a good job of calling this out, and I'll make this really clear. Our goal in this case on this landing was to hold about 92 knots. And so my power is going to continuously change as we're coming down final to hold that target airspeed. I'm adjusting power, I'm adding it in as the lulls happen, and I'm bringing it out as the headwinds come in, but I'm also doing so very gently. So we'll see if we can see any changes. Looks like you can see, yeah. Look at that. So you can see that percent power is changing all the way down. And there's a couple things that you can use to indicate, when you need to add power and when you don't. First of all, your airspeed indicator. A headwind is going to cause extra airspeed. So you might bring the power out a little bit. And as that headwind dies, as that gust dies, that airspeed is going to bleed off, like wind shear. And so you'll bring the power back in. But one of the issues is you're really focused on the runway, and you've got a scan pattern going. Outside, inside, outside, inside, but you're much more outside than inside. You should be much more outside during a landing than you are looking inside. So there's another really good indicator, and that's your aiming point. As you end up with headwinds, and as you end up with that gust die out, you're going to see your glide angle change. So that headwind is typically going to lift you up, and you'll see the aiming point start to sink. And that's where you can start to bring the throttle back. And as you start to see that aiming point start to rise up, you're going to bring the throttle forward. And the interesting thing is, if you were to ever fly without the airspeed indicator, you shouldn't have any risk of stalling the airplane. Because on a nice straight-in final, you've got a pitch attitude that you know and recognize, and you can use power to maintain that aiming point, and that will keep the airplane flying. Now, the big common error here that we see is overly aggressive power inputs, and that's one of the problems. We can quickly move from gust changing the airspeed to pilot-induced oscillations, where all of a sudden massive changes in power are starting to change the aircraft's airspeed and glide angle, and you can't tell where those gusts stop and where your control inputs begin. So one of the things that I say is this really does depend on the airplane and the size of engine and the airplane's characteristics. So in the Warrior, I found that the power changes were a little bigger than in the SR-22 Turbo, which seems to have a little bit less of an effect from the gusts. And it really depends on the airplane you're flying. But one of the things that I always think about is if my hands are going like this, and this is where a GoPro in the cockpit can help and you can watch afterwards. If you really feel like you're moving that throttle lever or the push-pull knob in really aggressively, you're probably overdoing it. And it's really easy to get into those pilot-induced oscillations. So you want to try to keep those changes gentle. And part of the advantage of the padding you add on, that half gust factor, is you're leaving yourself some room. You're not trying to hold the airspeed perfectly stable, but you are making small power corrections to keep the airspeed within range. And if you end up with situations where it drops aggressively or you feel like, wow, I need a ton of power, the right solution there is to go around, come back, readjust your speed, and try to keep the landing smooth. Okay, next question.
Next up, this one's coming from Stan, and he says, does air density affect landing in gusts?
It does, but in a way different than most people think. And the biggest thing you're going to notice is that your indicated airspeed is always the same. No matter what altitude that you're flying at, you're going to use a constant indicated airspeed. So when we're landing in Telluride, which is 9,000 feet in the summer, DA's oftentimes 13 to 14,000 feet, I'm still flying the same indicated final approach speeds that I fly when I fly into Eugene, Oregon, which is essentially at sea level. That's the beauty about your airspeed indicator. It's affected by density, so it takes all of that out of the equation. That being said, your true airspeed is completely different. And we really notice this in the summer in the mountains. your true airspeed is, for us, oftentimes about 110 knots, where normally we should be about 80 knots coming over the runway. So now we've got an extra 30 knots of ground speed. And that's one of the things, like I was doing if you've seen our landings course, we spent 3 days filming at a Steamboat, and I think I did 500 landings. But to try to nail a point landing in summer in Steamboat is a little bit more challenging because I've got an extra 25 knots of ground speed on the airplane that I wouldn't have when I'm at sea level. So you're going to find that the airplane, the float is a little harder to control. So that's the biggest thing you're going to notice. At high density altitudes, you're going to have a little faster ground speed, but your indicated airspeed indicator, that's the same. The other issue you really need to think about at high DA isn't necessarily your final approach, but what happens if you execute a go-around. And if you're flying at high density altitudes, especially in a heavy airplane or in an airplane that is normally aspirated, that's not turbocharged or supercharged or turbonormalized, one of the issues you could have at full flaps is if you try to take the aircraft around, you just don't have the engine power to get the airplane to climb quickly. And that can be a problem. So I know pilots who are flying aircraft with lower power engines in the mountains in the summer who will use partial flaps on landing because they still have the stopping distance. But the advantage is they don't have all the drag in when they execute a go-around. The first half of your flap range is more lift than drag. So it's going to give you better takeoff performance. It's going to get you off the ground faster, and it doesn't give you that drag penalty. The second half of the flap range, and this is a generalization, but usually true, adds more drag than lift. That's why it's great on landing. It gives you a nice steep approach angle. It's still giving you lift, extra lift, so it's depressing your stall speed. It's allowing you to fly slower, but it's adding a lot of drag. And of course, the downside of that is if you go around, especially at high DA, where you don't have a lot of horsepower left, full flaps, that can be tough. So in gusty winds, and to go back to that flaps question, in gusty winds at high DA with an airplane that's definitely performance limited, 50% flaps or less, or using a lower flap setting might not be a bad idea on landing. Okay, next question.
Next up from John, he says, I recently landed at a towered airport that was landing traffic with light, gusty tailwinds. Do you recommend changing airspeed and flaps in these situations for a high wing, or should you just ask for a different runway?
I would ask for a different runway. I have a general thing. If you watch one of our videos on YouTube about landing in Aspen with a gusty wind, gusty headwinds are a challenge. Gusty quartering headwinds are a little more challenging because you're mixing the crosswind. In my view, gusty tailwinds are a don't. There's a lot of problems that come along with that. First of all, you've got a much faster ground speed as you're coming up on the runway, and so you're landing the aircraft fast even though you're at the correct indicated airspeed. So not only is your ground roll going to be longer, but you're on a tricycle. If you're on a tricycle gear airplane, even a tailwheel, it doesn't behave well when it's going fast on the ground. And so now you've just got less stability on the aircraft. Plus, you're adding in, a quartering, maybe gusting tailwind, which tends to destabilize the airplane even further. I'd ask for another runway. There's some cases where tower will want to stick with an opposite direction landing when they have gusty winds. One of them is if the weather requires an ILS and they only have an ILS to one direction. They might try to keep that runway open. But the reality is, as a pilot, you're the one who's got to make a decision as to whether the winds are too bad for you to handle. And the tower controller is really relying on you to give them that information. The other thing that you could find, and this happens sometimes at Metro, the indication that they get in the windsock isn't always what's happening. And pilots are sometimes afraid to speak up about it and say, yeah, we're picking up strong tailwinds here in final. Can we try the opposite direction? Tower's kind of looking for pilots to tell them what's happening. Because again, what they can see is, their wind meters. They can see the wind socks. But that's really only part of the picture. The more we fly, the more we know, things really change out there. So what I would say is, if you're coming into an airport that's got a gusting tailwind, especially a gusting quarterly tailwind, I'm going to ask for a different runway. And tower is going to work to help you out. And, at Aspen, for us, that simply meant 1.5 is our normal landing runway. Winds are like 20 knots, gusting to 26. We're not going to land with a 26 knot tailwind. I will land with a 10 knot tailwind on a long runway, as long as it's steady, And even 10 I get a little bit iffy about. But when it starts gusting, we want to turn around. So they asked us to hold over the city of Aspen. And if you haven't seen that video, we did it a few years ago. It's actually kind of cool because that is a tight hold, but it's a fun hold. And just by hold, I mean you just circle over the city. And then from there, once they could kind of break off the jet traffic, Aspen's a tight airport, then they brought us in on 3-3. And so Tower will work to accommodate you. They will never make you land on a runway you don't want to land on. And they're not going to say, no, you can't land here. So that's what I do. Next question.
Next up from Cyril, he says, can you talk about crosswinds and gusts when a new pilot is unsure of their limits, especially if it occurs at the destination airport? And I think he's probably talking about a solo cross country here.
Okay, that's a great question, because one of the issues that you can run into is you end up in a scenario where you get down to your destination, especially when you're not very experienced, and you're looking at the weather and you go, man, this really doesn't look good to me. So one of the things that I always tell new VFR pilots or solo pilots, carry a lot more fuel than you need. Always carry enough fuel to get to another airport. As you start to get more experience, you may not necessarily have the same alternate requirements, but especially when you're just learning or when you feel inexperienced in the airplane, not even, you could have thousands of hours, but you feel inexperienced in the airplane, always have a good alternate. And I don't mean an alternate that's right next to you, not one that's 20 miles away, but one that you can get to that the weather will be a little bit different. That's the best thing you can do. The second thing is to keep in mind, use your information. Use your resources. It wasn't too long ago we came back into Metro and we ended up with fog that moved in several hours early. We ended up shooting a surprise instrument approach. And we had enough fuel. We had our IFR requirements, no problem. But we didn't have a ton of extra fuel. And one of the things that I was talking about was those TAFs had changed en route. And we probably should have been monitoring ADSB a little bit closer to pick up the change in TAF and the change in weather. Because honestly, I probably would have landed somewhere else and picked up gas. By the time the fog rolled in, I mean, it literally rolled in as we were joining the localizer course. And so, I mean, it was kind of right at that point. But had I seen that forecast change and the fog move earlier, I probably would have landed somewhere. So the message here is simply, you have so much information on board an airplane now. Even if the airplane isn't equipped with anything new, even if it's got the newest radios from the 1980s. You probably have an iPhone or an iPad or an Android, so you might have Garmin Pilot, you might have ForeFlight, and if you're down low, oftentimes you've got a cellular connection if you need it. Keep an eye on the weather. Watch what's happening. Watch those forecasts, watch the winds. Winds can pick up suddenly. We've seen that, especially as fronts move through, but usually then if you have an idea where the fronts are, you can find somewhere else to go. And then finally, one of the problems I think people struggle with when it comes to landing, especially when you're new and you're on your first solo or a solo cross country and things feel unfamiliar, is you start to feel forced to do something. You're forced to land the airplane. And the reality is you really should never feel forced to land the airplane unless you're about ready to run out of fuel. And then, yep, the airplane will start to come down. But you have a lot of options. And so one of those is to set up and just say, I'm going to fly the pattern, but I'm not going to land. I'm just going to fly the pattern and I'm going to bring it in and I'm going to do an intentional go around on short final and just see how comfortable I feel. And do that, and let yourself get comfortable with that pattern before you touch down. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I was a check pilot at UND. It's a Part 141 school, so we gave check rides. And I gave a lot of end-of-course check rides for private, commercial, multi-engine. And one of the smartest things that I could see a private pilot applicant do is a go-around on their own just to practice. I had to have them execute one anyways as part of the check ride. And usually I had to surprise them. But more often than not, I saw bad setups or nervous pilots, and it's like, man, if you just practiced this once and went around and flew it again and then landed it, you feel a lot more comfortable. So one of those things is, you don't have to make your first landing. You don't have to make your second landing. Don't be afraid of going around and just feeling out the airport. And if you start to get really stressed out and you're sitting there going, man, this just doesn't feel right, take the airplane out of the traffic pattern, go 3 or 4 miles away so you can still visually see it. You can see where the airport is, tell the pattern what you're doing, and just put yourself in a nice orbit and think about what your options are. Because you might have a close airport next to you that's got better winds. They still may be a little bit gusty, but they may be better down the pipe, more aligned with the runway. That's where I go. And I know on a solo cross country, your instructor signs off your endorsement and says, these are the airports that I've approved you to go to. But that does not force you to land at each of those airports if you don't feel it's safe. If you're looking at it going, man, I cannot make that landing and I need to get fuel, but there's an airport right over here, man, I can make that landing. Then go there and land there. Don't take off. You need to get another endorsement to depart that runway, but the instructor can give it to you over the phone. So that's my advice on that. Okay, next question.
Okay, you can definitely relate to this one, Alex. So Daniel says, I have a turbo arrow T-tail. If you idle this plane, it just drops out of the sky. Any recommendations besides don't idle? And I think probably one of our videos here, and the power reduction would be a great example.
So, my guess is that turbo arrow is probably very similar. I've flown an arrow, but not a turbo arrow. And my guess is it's probably very similar to the 22 turbo. And that airplane, if I pull the power back past probably about 20%, we're on our way down. In fact, the first time I flew it on a demo ride, I tried to land it like a Warrior, which didn't work out well. So it's one of those airplanes you have to leave the power in. And so one of the things that we talk about is finding your normal power setting. We'll jump back to the heads-up display here. Let me make sure I got the right one loaded. Let's do the full landing. So what I said is, in this scenario, we're looking for about 92 knots. I'm working my power there. But in the SR22 Turbo, I know that my normal landing power percent, we do percent power, but this could be manifold pressure, or if you're in a fixed pitch propeller, RPM, you just got whatever your power indicator is. I know that I'm normally going to be 30% on landing, or really more like about 26% the way we're typically loaded. And so I've got a little bit more. You notice we're running about 31 because I'm fighting a headwind. And so because of that, I'm going to need more power to keep my glide path constant. And I'm going to keep adjusting that. But one of the things that I always tell people, especially in high performance or heavy airplanes, is know what power setting you're going to use for your normal weight on a normal day. And then if you're fighting a strong headwind, you're going to add a little bit to that. And it's not 10% or 20%. It's usually, I should say it might be 10% or 20. It's not 50 or 60%. You're not doubling your power. We're not going from 26 to 50%. We're just going to add a little bit. So, as I said, maybe add 5 or 6%. Here gets us up to 31. You're probably using manifold pressure, but it's the same concept. What you want to do is find what manifold pressure setting that you're typically at on a normal day, on a normal, light headwind, stable day. Find that out, write it down. And it'll change with weight, but it doesn't change a ton, especially in heavy airplanes. It's a fairly, kind of static number. And then you always want to stay close to that. You're fighting a gusty headwind that's strong, you're going to add a little bit to it. And if you end up with a tailwind, you're actually going to have a little bit less. One of the things when I was teaching a lot in the SR22 Turbo, I could tell when an approach was going to go wrong because we were far off from that kind of standard, known power setting. The same was true in the SR20. So when we get kind of far off from those power settings, things start to go bad. If you know that number, it's easy. And if you're flying an airplane that's not heavy turbocharged, it works for you too. Your changes might be a little bit bigger. The lighter you get, but the reality is the same concept. Know that home power setting. And as you said, should I ever be pulling it to idle? No, I mean, never, especially in a heavy airplane. But if you know your power setting, you'll know when you're departing that. Okay, next question.
Okay, Jeff's question is the maximum demonstrated crosswind component in a POH related to a steady wind, or does it include gusts?
It's a steady wind crosswind. That's basically, and it's demonstrated. A lot of numbers are computed, but it's the maximum demonstrated crosswind component. So that means they actually went out there and flew it. I know for some aircraft manufacturers, they'll take them out to like Gillette and they'll find crosswinds there and they'll fly them. And keep in mind, first of all, this isn't a limitation. And second of all it's really telling you is the company's pilot, one of their test pilots or their engineering or production test pilots or someone went out there and flew this airplane and used normal crosswind technique and was able to land the airplane up to that level of a crosswind component. it doesn't mean that they didn't try anything higher or lower. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't use higher crosswinds. It just simply means this is the highest wind that the manufacturer flew a normal crosswind approach in and made a landing. The Cirrus at 17 knots. You'll notice in a lot of airplanes at 17 knots, even though the aircraft differ. And so I always tell people, you need to take that maximum demonstrated crosswind component with a big grain of salt. First of all, if the crosswind is gusty, you're going to want to use, that number becomes significantly smaller because now it's varying and your control inputs are varying. If the runway's contaminated, they're landing on a dry runway. I've seen airplanes go off the runway in Wyoming, typically have icy weather in the winter and strong crosswinds. And even though it may be below that maximum demonstrated component, with a very proficient pilot, a CFI or a high time pilot, runway contamination makes a big difference. So yeah, when they certify it, they're looking for a steady crosswind. But the key is, take it with a grain of salt. If you're very proficient with crosswinds, you might land over that. We've definitely landed over the maximum demonstrated crosswind component without any issues. But that was when we were very, very proficient with crosswinds and the runway's completely dry and not contaminated. And there's other times where I've had that and the runway's a mess and it's gusty and I'm like, yep, we're going somewhere else. So, okay, next question.
Okay, next up, Mitch wants to know, does a crosswind or a gusty wind have any effect on your ground effect and your landing in general?
It blows the cushion of air out from underneath you. So it tends to cause you to stop. Now, ground effect, I'm going to jump to an animation here. Ground effect is, let's see here, where is... No, that's not the one. Give me 1 second. I'd use the bounce is what I was looking for. Okay, so let's take a look at what's happening. Let's assume we're not going to bounce this. As we come in, especially with the high angle of attack, you have upwash, and we've got a low pressure on top of the wing. I'm going to draw that up there so you can see it. And we've got a high pressure below the wing. And that high pressure is, of course, what gives you that lifting force. But then you also have your wingtip, and it's not infinite. That's why high aspect ratio wings reduce drag, but it's not infinite. So what happens is the air escapes around the wingtip from the bottom to the top, right? Wingtip vortices. Most people know about these. And they're going to cycle backwards. And that's what actually bends that airflow down. That airflow, when it bends down like that, it takes the lift and essentially it starts to bend it backwards because the relative wind actually kind of cants up a little bit. And so the lift starts to bend back. And now, if we were to draw this a little more cleanly, if it's kind of here, you have a portion of lift pulling up and you have a portion of lift pulling back. That is drag. As we get closer to the ground interferes with that downwash. You have less of it. So as opposed to being maybe that much, it'll start to come out and go to that much. And so what happens is your lifting arrow, which I'm drawing this, exaggerated, but which was back here, starts to point a little bit more vertically. And essentially, you run out of, you start to decrease that drag from lift. You start to run out of drag on the airplane. And so the effect that we notice as pilots is that the airplane tends to float. I mean, it just keeps going. And the reason it's floating is because you're losing drag. And so it doesn't want to slow down as fast anymore. It wants to keep going. The wind isn't going to affect the high pressure and low pressure regions around your wing. It's not going to have an effect there. So you're still going to be generating all that wash and all the wake turbulence, or not the wake turbulence, but the vortices up at altitude. And it's still going to go away as you come close to the runway. But you might notice the ground effect really doesn't affect me anymore. And that's because ground effect, it causes you to float. And anything that causes you to float is less noticeable in a strong wind because the wind is basically opposing you and it's shrinking that float up. It's compacting it back. So you still have all the ground effect you normally would have had. But with that headwind and possibly a gust that dies in the loss of associated airspeed, you don't notice the float as much. So short answer is it's still happening. It's still there. The vortices aren't changing. The downwash isn't changing. But the headwind makes it less noticeable. But one thing I'll say on that has nothing to do with landing, but it does have to do with takeoffs and landing behind an airplane, is that when you have a strong wind or a crosswind, it's going to blow the vortices away from the runway, or it's going to, if it's a headwind, kind of expand the vortices down the runway. So wake turbulence will clear out a lot quicker. If you've got a really strong crosswind, you won't notice as much wake turbulence on the runway, if any. If the winds are dead and light, those vortices will sit there and linger for quite a long time. And so one of the benefits of a gusty wind and a gusty crosswind is it does clear any wake turbulence out of the way, so all you have left is the wind's turbulence. Okay, that's all the time we've got. In 10 minutes, we're going to be starting another live stream, and that's on holding pattern entries. So if you're an instrument rated pilot or you're thinking about getting your instrument rating, we're going to walk through the 3 different types of holding pattern entries. We're going to talk about how to choose the right kind of entry, and my favorite trick that we can use, it's not really a trick, it's widely known, but it's oftentimes forgot of, a cool way to look at your heading indicator or your HSI and easily figure out how to fly a pattern entry. And we're also talking about correcting with wind. The link to that broadcast is down below. It's got to be a separate YouTube video. So if you're interested, click the link down below. And as always, we really want to know what you'd like to hear about in our next episode, which will be 2 weeks from now. So there's a link to send us information on that. We look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks.